there, but has everything to do with intrinsic properties of the organism. So let's elaborate on that a little bit more. I want to show you one other slide. Yeah, so if you actually, this is very, very interesting. If you Google on chimp, then this is what you get. It's fascinating, right? But that's what you get. So then I right away, I'm a biologist, so I recognize this as a Homo sapiens in quotation marks. So then I took the Latin name to get the real chimps then. And the gorilla. Now, unfortunately, I lost from converting this from OpenOffice. I somehow lost the citation. This data is from a paper in 2012 in Nature by a group of researchers who studied gene expression in the great apes. So they used RNA-seq to study gene expression patterns. Now, gene expression, just like body mass, it's just a trait of an organism. Earlier we had large numbers of species and only one trait. Now we have a few species, but we have approximately 15,000 traits measured in the brain, in the cerebellum, in the heart, kidney, liver, and testis tissue. What I did for this plot, I'll try to walk you through this. Within a species there is variation between individuals in the expression level of a particular gene. Because they measured 5 or 6 individuals in every species, I can estimate the intraspecific, so the variation in a particular gene's expression level within a species. Now from that I calculate a mean. And from mathematical statistical theory, I know what the sampling variance of that mean will be. Now, if I take the means of 2 species, then the variance of the means is an estimate of the variation between the species. But I know that it will be inflated by the variation within the species. I can correct for that mathematically rather easily. I could just take the interspecific variation, you subtract the intraspecific variation of each species divided by 2. It's very simple. If I do that, what I get is a plot of the variation between species, so the interspecific variation in expression, as a function of the time since their most recent common ancestor. Actually, time is multiplied by 2. It's the distance on the phylogeny here rather than the time since the most, so this is not strictly correct. But if evolution were purely gradual, then these regression lines would be expected to go through the origin. Now, the only case where you could meaningfully argue that they go through the origin is here in the cerebellum. Mainly, like this dot is often lying under the curve because the 2 chimps are actually very similar to each other. Some people say that they're not actually species, that they're subspecies or populations. But if we take them as species, then they are very similar. But the overall pattern is that there is a substantial intercept. And this is not based on one gene. This is based on 15,000 genes, repeated measures. This data is very strong. There's hardly any variation around that, which clearly shows you that there is a punctuational component to evolution, not only in a character like body mass, but also in the expression of genes. And most of these genes, they never see the outside world. Yeah? It is very hard to argue that the expression of any particular gene would be an adaptation to the outside world. And even if, then there are so many of them that you cannot possibly select for them. So I will try to illustrate that. I told you that during the second half of the 20th century, evolutionary biologists came to believe Darwin's theory largely because there was a theoretical framework, but also there was empirical evidence. Some of the empirical evidence came from the work by Kettlewell on the peppered moth system, Biston betularia. Here you see a peppered moth, or actually here you don't see a peppered moth, on a natural tree. And here you have a tree suited by Dark from the British Industrial Revolution. And now suddenly this type, which initially occurred at low frequency because it's really easy to find for birds, that type became very common. And that's a rapid process. This demonstrated that evolution can really work. Yeah? This was an empirical demonstration of evolution by natural selection. And it convinced many people that this is how evolution works. Interestingly, it did not convince the person who perhaps wrote about it most. Because G.B.S. Haldane wrote that the frequency of the more conspicuous phenotype may be halved in a single day. Now, if the change of environment would have been so radical that 10 other independently inherited characters had been subject to selection of the same intensity, then only a half to the power 10, that is 1 in 1024, of the original genotype would have survived. Now, it is totally obvious that one individual moth cannot produce 1024 surviving offspring. Yeah? One individual moth cannot compensate for the loss of so many individuals. So Haldane said the species would presumably have become extinct. Yeah? So he said, well, we can do that with one character, but we cannot do that with many more. So he said in 1957, in his rather seminal paper, The Cost of Natural Selection, I shall try to make quantitative the fairly obvious statement that natural selection cannot occur with great intensity for a number of characters at once unless they happen to be controlled by the same genes, which would relatively rarely be the case. Yeah. So already in 1957, Haldane pointed this out. Leek van Welen, who speculated about mammal evolution, he reiterated this in 1967, I think, and called it Haldane's dilemma. Moto Kimura still wrote about this when he was 99 years old. He sent it in 1994 to PNAS, and they published it 3 months after his death in 1995. It was a 1.2-page article in which he explains that natural selection cannot occur on many characters at the same time, and he blamed evolutionary biologists for never realizing what Haldane thought was pretty obvious, as he wrote here, the fairly obvious statement. Yeah? So we're pretty far off there. Now, I want to illustrate to you why that is important. So I want to go back to Georges Cuvier, because Georges Cuvier wrote that today, and today means in 1798, comparative anatomy has reached such a point of perfection that after inspecting a single bone, one can often determine the class and sometimes even the genus of the animal to which it belonged, above all, if that bone belonged to the head or the limbs. This is because the number, direction, and shape of the bones that compose each part of an animal's body are always in a necessary relation to all the other parts, in such a way that up to a point one can infer the whole from any one of them, and vice versa. He, of course, wrote this in French. So he said that there is little point in changing one character if you do not change the rest. Yeah? He wrote that if an animal's teeth are such as they must be in order for it to nourish itself with flesh, then we can be sure without further examination that the whole system of its digestive organs is appropriate for that kind of food, and that its whole skeleton and locomotive organs, and even its sense organs, are arranged in such a way as to make it skillful at pursuing and catching its prey. For these relations are the necessary conditions of existence of the animal. If things were not so, it would not be able to subsist. There is no point in changing the eyes if you do not change the digestive tract, the enzymes that are there, the like muscles. Everything has to be changed in order to get something that functions again. Yeah? And he called this the conditions of existence, the conditions d'existence of his principle, the principe de la corrélation des formes. These were classic in paleontology. This idea was not even new in Cuvier's time, because look what Aristoteles had to say about this. The fittest mode, then, of treatment is to say that a man has such and such parts. This is from De Partibus Animalium, so on the parts of animals. A man has such and such parts because the conception of a man includes their presence, and because they are necessary conditions of his existence. The exact same words that Cuvier used. And their existence involved the existence of other antecedents. Thus we should say, because a man is an animal with such and such characters, therefore is the process of his development necessarily such as it is, and therefore is it accomplished in such and such an order, this part being formed first, that next, and so on in succession, and after a like fashion should we explain the evolution of all other works of nature. He wrote this approximately 350 years before Christ. Yeah, not bad. Moreover, when any one of the parts or structures is under discussion, it must not be supposed that it is its material composition which is the subject of the discussion, but the relation of such part to the total form. Yeah? Similarly, the true object of architecture is not bricks, mortar or timber, but the house. And so the principal object of natural philosophy is not the material elements, but their composition and the totality of the form, independently of which they have no existence. I think it's hard to say it in any more clear way. Now, I can't show you any parts of animals just like that, but I like the idea of bricks. So here you have some bricks. I like this box. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring my prehistoric raptors, but from the same bricks, you can make also this one, and you can also make this one. Yeah? It's the exact same bricks. It's great. Like, I like Legos. However, in order to do that, I have to take the whole thing apart and put it back together. Yeah? Now, if there would be a genetic code that codes for that thing, I would have to completely break it apart. I need a huge amount of mutations all at the same time. Because if I'm going to pull the head off, and I have to do that because I need to get the bricks that are in there, and I need to put them somewhere at the feet to get this one. Yeah? As soon as I pull the head off, it doesn't function anymore, right? A tyrannosaur without a head is not really functioning very well. Yeah, so I try to explain this to you to show that this has nothing to do with genetic correlation. This is a very simple principle. I can get something radically different if I do everything at once, but I cannot get there by small steps. And that is just because I cannot possibly select step by step without impairing the fitness of the organism. Yeah? The left leg of a tyrannosaur is not adapted to the environment. The left leg of a tyrannosaur is adapted to the right leg of a tyrannosaur. I can easily demonstrate that to you by removing the right leg, and then the animal is laying there on the table and it really doesn't do anything meaningful. Yeah? So the body parts of animals are not adapted to the environment. They're also perhaps in some cases adapted to the environment, but mostly they're adapted to the other parts. The genes that I showed you, the expression levels, they are adapted to the expression levels of the other genes, because together they have to do something meaningful. I can tinkle with one part of them, but presumably what will happen is that the organism doesn't function anymore. It may actually be simply dead. That doesn't give you very high fitness. So I would like to show you a few examples that evolutionary biologists tend to think of like clear examples of adaptation. For example, an Arctic fox. It's great, the fur is a little bit thicker and it is white. I would say it's a white fox. It's a white fox. A polar bear is a white bear. A mammoth is an elephant with slightly longer hair. Yeah? There are hardly any changes. Now, I'm not the first to point that out. As Maya pointed out, that most species displaying geographic variation vary clinally only in ecotypic characters affecting primarily size, proportions, and coloration, but show no significant evolutionary departures. This is not my idea. You can say that this is a magnificent adaptation. I haven't seen a single ectotherm who get at the idea of having a body temperature of 37 degrees at the North Pole. As soon as you can show me an ectotherm that is 37 degrees at Antarctica or at the North Pole, you have convinced me that this is adaptive. Until that, I think that this is very maladaptive. Now, why is that? Why is this so? Well, I can easily change the color of the fur to become white. That doesn't interfere with the rest of the organism. If I take that tyrannosaur and I take a spray, a paint spray, and they make it yellow, well, then I have a yellow tyrannosaur. Fine, still works, right? So if there would be something in the environment that favors yellow tyrannosaurs, well, then tyrannosaurs would have been yellow. But body temperature is a different thing. If I change the body temperature, the animal has fever, because there are several hundred enzymes that function rather well at that body temperature. And changing the body temperature would presumably decrease the fitness, even though the environment might favor it. The environment is only one factor among myriads. Yeah? So what we get when we take a grizzly and we put it on the North Pole is it turns white. If we take fox and we put it in the Arctic, it turns white. Yeah? Those are the kind of things. If we take Biston betullaria and we put it on a dark tree, it turns black. Yeah? That is where the evidence for evolution comes from. But most characters show no significant evolutionary departures, as Ernst Mayr pointed out. And Ernst Mayr was still doing science when he was 99 years old, so he had some right to speak. I want to illustrate this with a simple example. Darwin saw this orchid, it was sent to him, a specimen, Angraecum sesquipedale. You can immediately notice the very long nectar spur. Here, let's see whether it still functions. The very long, no, this doesn't function. We don't care. You can see the long nectar spur. And Darwin predicted that there would be something that pollinates this. And he thought, well, probably a hawk moth, because in South America he had seen hawk moths with very long proboscis. And that was considered a ridiculous prediction, because the Duke of Argyll argued that this is a prime example of divine creation. Now, it took a very long time, but at some point somebody found on Madagascar the subspecies of Xanthopan margani, and they gave it the epithet predicta because Darwin had predicted this. And this was for a long time heralded as a prime example of the predictive capacity of evolutionary theory. Still in textbooks written nowadays, you can read that this is a prime example. Now, I beg to have a different opinion there. This was the idea that Darwin had. So the individuals with very long nectar spurs, those will be pollinated by the hawk moths trying to get to the nectar, but the hawk moths will not get to the nectar. Yeah? So the hawk moths should, in that case, develop a longer tongue, because then they can more easily get the nectar from the longest spurs. There's little competition there, because the competitors with shorter proboscis can't get that. But as the proboscis become longer, then of course the flower, the orchid, has to respond with even longer spurs, because now the moths with the longest tongues, they get the nectar, but they don't pollinate the flower. So you get an arms race, and that could explain why the proboscis became so long. And most evolutionary biologists buy that story. I would like to see an explanation as to why the nectar spur is not 2.5 meters. I would also like to know why the vast majority of orchids has a nectar spur that is about this long. I would also like to know why the moths don't have spurs, or like all moths have really long spurs, because then they can get the nectar out of just about any flower. Yeah? So evolutionary theory is applied to the point where we think, oh, okay, now it's kind of fine, and then we don't ask the critical questions anymore. So when Whittle and Hodges actually made an analysis of this system, they saw, yes, there is a progression towards longer nectar spurs, but the changes actually occur rapidly when you get a new species. They do not seem to increase over time. So Darwin's model really doesn't seem to fit. They found greater support for a model where the changes were rapid and associated with speciation. And Tony Bradshaw actually pointed this pattern out. Like, most of these species do not have these long proboscis, not those long nectar spurs. Tony Bradshaw, in his Croonian lecture to the Royal Society, he wrote that most species are very stable. And in situations where evolution is observed in one species, often, so in one species, let's say this, often none is found in others, the rest, despite equivalent opportunity. And we fail to predict that. Evolutionary biologists don't seem to bother about that, like, who cares? But we fail to predict this. And I will try to explain to you why that is relevant. I'll skip that one. No, I'll not skip that one. One thing about body temperature. I think very many people believe that evolution is a reversible process. That if I can make a white moth out of a black moth, I can also make a black moth out of a white moth, right? It should go both ways. I would argue that that is not the case. Think of an ectotherm, a small lizard. It has proteins that function over a wide range of temperatures because it's an ectotherm. Now, as the climate warms, an ectotherm can become larger for reasons I won't go into. At some point, you have a warm climate and really large lizards. We call them dinosaurs. Now, if you are really large, then just because of your large size, you become a homeotherm. Because it takes ages to cool down a huge dinosaur. Just by the thermal inertia, they are homeotherm. Now think of all the proteins. If earlier they had to work over a wide range of temperatures, now they don't have to do that anymore. So if you have a mutation in a particular protein that would make it work better at a particular temperature, that would, in principle, be beneficial. I'm not saying that these are fixed through natural selection, but if they emerge, like there's little selection against them at least. Yeah? So if the climate changes and it becomes colder again, you might want to become colder. You might want to drop your body temperature. You might even want to become an ectotherm again. Is that possible? Well, then you have to change all these proteins at the same time. You cannot change them one by one. Earlier, every change was beneficial, and you could accumulate them over a long period of time. But if I change 5 proteins out of 1,000, then it just makes things worse, because the body temperature hasn't dropped yet. And if I drop the body temperature, well, then the other 995 proteins haven't changed yet. So now suddenly we're in a situation where you have to change everything. Yeah. And I don't know of any example where a homeotherm has evolved into an ectotherm, actually, like a fully developed homeotherm that developed into an ectotherm. It would be really interesting if that has happened, to see how that occurred. Yeah. The other way around seems to go like more easily. So I think that there is, like, at some point, certain factors that become effectively constant, they become important for the organism. It is important to regulate these. And actually Claude Bernard already in the 18th century pointed out that most of the properties of organisms are targeted at maintaining the stable state, maintaining homeostasis inside the organism. They are not having a function for anything. Keep your blood pressure constant. Yeah? That's one thing that's incredibly important to us. Keep your body temperature constant, incredibly important. Keep osmotic values constant, incredibly important. Keep salt concentration constant. Loads of things are only homeostasis. Because if at some point we were living in an ocean where salt concentrations were actually constant, and the proteins became such that they worked at this, well, then afterwards, even if you're in a totally different environment, it is really difficult to change that. It's really difficult to change all these proteins at the same time. So you have to develop methods to keep them constant. And that means you become more complex. So there I want to make like, here you see, I perhaps have to explain, I don't know how much David has been talking about, but as you make organisms larger, they consume more food. But that relation is not a proportional relation. Relative to their body mass, large organisms consume less food compared to small ones. We call that metabolic scaling. Now, the exponent of that relationship is something that has got a lot of attention, and I don't care about it. But there is an intercept to that relation. And that intercept in that relation, that is a measure of how much energy you need to maintain the stable state, to just maintain the entropy of your body, just maintain your own complexity. Because there is nothing else that you're doing. You're not digesting food, you're just only maintaining stable state, only maintaining entropy. Now here you see the cost of maintaining entropy, so the intercept of that metabolic relationship, and how it has changed from the Cambrian through the Ordovician, Devonian. Like these are groups in which we measure it, of course, in present-day species, but we know when they first appear in the fossil record. And you see that the cost of maintaining the entropy of so the state of complexity just increases incredibly. I don't know whether this is an active trend, whether there is some advantage of being complex. I don't think so. I don't think so, really. Because we still have a lot of bacteria around, they're doing fine. This could very well be just a passive consequence of evolution not being a reversible process, but being irreversible towards greater complexity. You can make a homeotherm out of an ectotherm, but not the other way around. Well, anyway, that was a bit of a sidestep. So now that we have such large complex systems, will they be stable? Well, Robert May wrote an influential paper where he analyzed under what conditions complex systems would be stable. This was not related to the systems that I've been talking about. This is related to food webs. So if we take away a predator, what happens to the food web? If we reduce the numbers of individuals in a prey species, what happens in the food web? Now, they have a tendency to revert back to a stable state. But if you have super threshold actions, then they can cascade into a completely different state. Some species may even go extinct, but there is an entirely different equilibrium. Now, that inspired, again, Ernst Mayr, and Ernst Mayr made great contributions to biology. Ernst Mayr came up with peripatric speciation. He came up with the biological species concept. He had a lot of contributions, but when he was interviewed in the late 1980s and Provine asked him to say what was his most important contribution to biology, it was not the biological species concept or something. He immediately asked, so he immediately replied, genetic revolutions. The idea that you have a complex, you exert a superthreshold action, and it becomes something radically different. So the person who has perhaps been, he worked together with Theodosius Dobzhansky. Steve Gould was his laboratory assistant. He knew Simpson and Haldane personally. He was recruited to Harvard from Germany because they felt that they needed his competence there. He nominated several people for starting Max Planck institutes in Germany. He was a Harvard professor still when he was 99 years old, and he said that his most important contribution was without hesitation genetic revolutions. If you Google it in the Web of Science, there is no paper from the last 10 years with genetic revolutions in the title, because the ignorance of many people working in evolutionary biology is tremendous. I was on the speciation conference, and they asked a few people who regard themselves as very knowledgeable about speciation what they thought about genetic revolutions, and they laugh a little bit. Well, we don't really have much evidence for that, right? So I said, so what are genetic revolutions? Well, we don't really know. So I said, no, given that you don't really know, how can you say that we don't have very much evidence for it? And at that point I realized that you're not a graduate student. Well, anyways, so the quantum evolution that I talked with you about Simpson, I think we have pretty good evidence by now that this actually does occur. And I think we also have some ideas as to why it would occur, that it is not something that comes out of the blue sky. If organisms are complex systems, then this is kind of what we would expect in their behavior. It is very like exactly what triggers them, that's a different story. But we would hardly expect those systems to evolve gradually. That's at least something that seems rather unlikely. So we can speculate about exactly what mechanisms are involved, but so far, like Jaroslav has made contributions there, but there are very few people who even realize that we have a problem. And that's a little bit scary. So I would also say that evolutionary biologists tend to think that evolution is most rapid where selection is most intense. If you really intensely select for something, well, then it should evolve rapidly, right? But that is not what we observe. The most striking examples of evolution, like here, the Hawaiian silversword alliance, these are close relatives. A tiny shrub, very small plants. This is a tree. Those are close relatives. Hawaii isn't that old. They have had only a few million years to get here. How come that we see such dramatic evolution? Well, there is nothing to compete with. If you are totally dysfunctional, a tyrannosaur with only one leg, you can still survive if there is nothing to compete with. Where does that happen? Well, on oceanic islands, especially barren oceanic islands like Hawaii. That is where we can see that kind of thing. We don't see it happening where competition is intense. We don't see it happening where even the slightest deficiency is immediately going to kill you. It's not on the African savanna. It is in those kind of places. So evolution is not most rapidly where selection is most intense. Evolution is most rapid where selection is almost absent. For example, in domestication, my dog is very maladapted. Its legs are too short, its hair is growing so fast that it doesn't see anything. It looks like it has a frontal accident so that its nose actually came into it. And it's very happy, like it doesn't care about this. And if I would dump it into the forest, it would probably be dead within a week. And it doesn't matter in which forest I dump it, it will always be dead within a week because it's just the body parts don't fit together. It has intrinsic low fitness. But that doesn't matter because I give it food every day. It survives, and that is exactly how that animal came into existence in the first place. That is domestication. We keep them alive. And that is how Darwin could see all those fancy races of pigeons. So I want to emphasize that this is not something that is restricted to biological organizations. If you work at the university, then that kind of thing looks probably very common to you. We have all kinds of regulations, boards, and they're deciding all kinds of things that you didn't even know had to be decided. But little by little, you get several hundred pages of rules and regulations. Now, if you want to change something that is really simple, then you have to rewrite all these 300 pages of rules and regulations. Now, guess what we do? We don't change it. So that is why very many government organizations are incredibly conservative. You think, well, why can't they do this? Well, because they feel that all these regulations have to somehow be internally coherent. If you're coming up with a new law, then somehow it should be in agreement with the rest of the law, right? You can't just simply come up with something new. So these processes are incredibly intricate. You have to look, yes, but with which other laws does this interfere? And then you have to see whether it's compatible. You can only make changes that are allowed in the overall framework. And as we're coming with more and more and more and more rules and regulations and laws, the scope for any change becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And that is where whole institutions, just companies, they just disappear. Because they also have this like thing that they become really good at doing something, and then when they need to change, they can't, because there's all these internal regulations of how we do things, and it's not fit anymore. So change of grammar, for example, that goes in a punctuated fashion. Mark Pagel did some, and like languages change rather rapidly when they emerge, and then they are fairly stable. Political systems change often by revolution rather than by gradual change. Scientific theories, we have a number of things that are somehow coherent. They make sense together. Now, you cannot change any component of that if you believe all the rest. If you believe in quantitative genetics as it is written now, you can throw away these theories of punctuational change because it just doesn't allow for it. So you have to doubt certain like things in a broader perspective. And at some point, you will trigger a revolution. At some point, the knowledge proceeds so far it's simply not compatible, but then a lot of other things change as well. What you get is not necessarily better than what you started from. I should point that out. The result of such a change, it can just cascade. It is mainly internal factors. If a university comes up with a new rule, several things may start to cascade, and what you get may actually be worse than what you were hoping for, because nobody has any view on how these things start to cascade in a complex system. That is very unfortunate. In biology, we have no equations describing this, but other people have no equations either. We just don't know how to model these systems. So I want to like finish up with a few things in biology. So fitness traditionally is viewed as an extrinsic property. Fitness, in some textbooks, you can read it explicitly as only defined by the outside environment. Well, no, my dog has intrinsic low fitness. So I would say fitness has a large intrinsic component. How large the intrinsic and extrinsic components are, that depends. Color, well, probably has a large extrinsic component. Body temperature has a very large intrinsic component. Genetic variation is traditionally regarded as causing phenotypic variation. Like Mendel's ideas, if you have this allele, your flower will be purple. Have you that allele, it will be white. Now think about a plant growing on a high latitude place somewhere. Few people would say that the temperature is so low because the plant has this allele. No, we rather say it can grow here because it has this allele. Now, that suggests, if we assume that traits are adapted to each other, then, well, yes, it can have this long a tail because it has this allele somewhere else. So genetic variation allows for phenotypic variation. It does not cause phenotypic variation. And that's a very important distinction. Now, evolution is traditionally thought to happen by allelic substitution, but if you have a sexually reproducing organism, then it should not just do something nice with a trait. It should be compatible with all these other genes with which it is interacting. Chances of that being the case is pretty remote. So rather, evolution by gene duplication, I would say, where you have a gene that can do something novel, whereas the existing copy still fulfills the functions that are required by the rest of the organism. Evolution is not fastest where selection is strong. Evolution is fastest where selection is weak or absent. Or where you keep the animals alive artificially. Change is often not gradual. Like species are very static. They fluctuate within a certain range. That range can be wide for some characters that are not so very important for other characters. But for body temperature, for example, that range is very narrow. So yes, we see changes in Darwin's finches' beaks over time, but they're about half a population standard deviation per year. They're about half a population standard deviation per decade, per decennium, and also over a million years. Yeah? So they just fluctuate, but they don't get out of a certain tolerance zone. So they are dynamically static, and we have quantum evolution, perhaps by genetic revolutions, as Maya said. I'm sure that Jaroslav has given you like more insights into that than I can give you. That's not really my area. So there would be a lot of scope for adaptation in Darwin's story, but as Falconer pointed out, we don't see very much of that. So more pre-adaptation, ecological fitting. You have a particular beak and you happen to find food that you can eat with it. Great for you, you'll survive. Huh? There is many textbooks claim that we have evidence that the Darwin's finches evolved their beaks in response to the food they're eating. Well, within a population we have that evidence. But we have no evidence whatsoever that also explains the differences between the species. That's just an extrapolation that evolutionary biologists have made. And there is very little empirical evidence to base it on. So environmental change would lead to adaptive change. Well, you would almost think so, because when we see periods of dramatic climate change, we see a lot of evolution. But that evolution is not necessarily adaptive and gradual. Like environmental change leads to a lot of niche tracking. We know that. Niche tracking is the prevailing response, and especially extinction, and you may be replaced by other species, either novel ones or species that existed somewhere else, and they fit the environment better. But there is very little evidence actually for environmental change leading to a lot of adaptive evolution. Johan Merile said, I talked with him a few weeks ago, he did a meta-analysis. I think they looked at more than 200 studies trying to find evidence for adaptive evolution to current climate change. Only a handful, I think just like 5 studies could actually show that. And the majority of the studies that could distinguish, because of their design, between plastic change and adaptive change all showed it was plastic. So that's something to think about. Here in the traditional view there's a lot of additive genetic covariation, and that limits the potential for evolution. Now it is not clever to have a trait like body temperature having a large additive genetic basis. That would make no sense whatsoever, because your offspring will presumably be largely dead. Because of the variation that is involved, it is very unlikely that if it would actually be segregating in the population, that all these other traits would somehow also be adapted. So these traits that are actually really important, they typically have a strong genetic basis, but it is non-additive. And it is, because of that, very difficult for selection to act on. So rather we have complex, non-linear genotype to phenotype maps and interactions between traits that limit the potential for evolution. Body temperature hardly evolves. There's very little scope for it. Why? Well, it is co-adapted with hundreds of other traits. And there is very little scope for getting these to change altogether, so they don't change. So to summarize this whole story, this is what Falconer wrote to Darwin. He brought out this major volume on elephants, and he said that I don't see these characters changing despite the great climatic vicissitude of the Ice Age. Now Darwin replied to that, you speak of these animals as having been exposed to a vast range of climatic changes from before to after the glacial period. I should have thought that by migration, or local extinction when migration not possible, these animals might and would have kept under nearly the same climate. Now Darwin was correct here, of course. This is what species do, they migrate. Niche tracking we call it. This is what they do, and Darwin was aware of it. It's kind of interesting to see from the person who conceived the idea of evolution by natural selection and advocated it, that he says, well, but why would they adapt? They can track their niches, right, and otherwise go extinct. It's hardly an answer to Falconer. It's more a description of what they do than an answer to Falconer's question. Now just about a century later, Tony Bradshaw in his Croonian lecture says, it is customary to take these migrations for granted. We know that species migrate as a reflection of the ecological preferences of the species concerned. Yet is this acceptable? There is a valid alternative scenario that the species concerned could have remained in situ and coped with the environmental improvement by evolutionary change. And he says, it is so commonplace to think, yeah, of course they migrate, because that's what we observe that they do. But there is an alternative. They could actually adapt, just like Darwin had predicted. But he says there is no sign of this. The stability of the ecological preferences of the species in the face of such major environmental alterations is impressive. Now this is the Croonian lecture to the Royal Society. This is a prestige talk, right? You're not supposed to just say whatever there. Tony Bradshaw had quite some evidence to base this on. Just 3 years ago, Douglas Futuima, he wrote, "Indeed, we are led to confront an overridingly important question that highlights the immaturity of our science." Yes, Douglas was the head of the Society for the Study of Evolution, the president of the society. And he writes that the immaturity of our science, how can we predict whether a population or species will adapt or become extinct in the face of environmental change? And just continuing with the old same story of adaptive evolution is evidently not going to take us there. Because here we're back at the exact same question that Hugh Falconer asked Darwin 150 years earlier. Why do they not adapt? So this guy is going to go extinct, because we can nicely put a lot of tax money on research looking at the importance of genetic variation, but no species goes extinct because of lack of genetic variation. Mammoths did not go extinct because of a lack of genetic variation, because once they were widespread, if genetic variation were the problem, they would never be. Yes, certainly the last ones may die, and they have a few, they have very much eroded genetic variation, but that was never the reason why they became so few in the first place. It is theoretically very hard to explain why genetic variation would be an issue at all for extinction, except when you're already almost extinct. But that's hardly worth studying. So this guy is going to go extinct, because it will take quite a while before evolutionary biologists even figure out that what they're holding on to is perhaps not so very close to reality. And it will certainly be too late for these guys. So then I would like to thank the people. So this slide illustrates that also a research group is a complex functioning and often dysfunctioning constellation of people. You see where the people came from, and then especially where they went. I also want to thank some other collaborators who have not been in UMIA, and the institutions that funded my research. And of course I want to thank all of you for sitting here for an evening and listen to scientific talks. Thanks a lot.